Hi, I'm Martha Minow, and I am with great delight and enormous thanks to June Casey and the library going to introduce this very fascinating and timely event, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. We're thrilled to have James Forman Jr. here to present about his brand new book, important, bold, and incredibly powerful book. Just a word or two about him. You know, little things he's done along the way, clerking for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, spending 6 years as a public defender in D.C., co-founding an impressive and amazing charter school, the Maya Angelou Public Charter School, along the way. He teaches and has influential roles in criminal procedure and criminal law policy, as well as juvenile justice and education law policy. And his particular interests are in schools, in prisons, police, and the institutions these institutions and their racial and class dimensions. We couldn't be more thrilled that he is here. He is a professor at the Yale Law School, though some of us are working very hard to change his address. He's joined today on the panel by Professor Ronald S. Sullivan, Jr., Clinical Professor of Law, Director of the Criminal Justice Institute at Harvard Law School. I could spend the rest of the time talking about him, but I won't, because you know him, and if you don't, you better. And Bruce Western, who is the director of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy and the Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice Policy and Professor of Sociology at Harvard University, and one of the most sought-after experts on criminal justice. This talk is co-sponsored by the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice here at Harvard Law School, by the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management, Harvard Kennedy School, and I give my thanks to both of them. The lunch is on me, so say thanks, and you're welcome. And after the talk, a book is available to be purchased in the back, and James told me that he's willing to sign copies, so this is a rare and special opportunity. This event is being recorded, so know that when you're invited to give comments. And now, with no further ado, James Forman, thank you.
Thank you, Dean Minow, and thank all of you for coming out. There's so many people, friends, that I want to acknowledge. I won't be able to do that for everybody, but I do want to acknowledge I have family here, and I also want to acknowledge my editor, Alex Starr, who's here. I want to thank Dean Minow and June Casey and the hosts of this event, and I want to single out just there's so many people, but among the faculty here, Randy Kennedy is there standing against the wall, looking cool as he does. And he is somebody whose work I have admired since I was a law student. And he's somebody who has just been a staunch ally of mine and of so many young African-American and others, I'm sure, but I know him in that way, faculty members, people who are trying to get jobs in the legal establishment and in the academic establishment, and he has just been an absolute champion, and Randy, thank you. I want to also just acknowledge the Professor Western and Professor Sullivan and their willingness to come and do this. They're both very busy. Ron Sullivan has a jury deliberating, so he may be called away at any moment. But the fact that he would take the time out of his schedule to come and speak, when they put this panel together, they asked me, who did I want to provide comments? And I said, well, let me just start with the dream team. Let me start with the people that I would most love to have up here, and we'll see if they're available. And they both said yes. And it's particularly important to me that they're here because this is a book that's about African-American political history, social history, cultural and intellectual history. And it's important to me as I go forward in having conversations about this book to have some of the leading African-American thinkers on criminal justice, the leading black intellects, in conversation about this topic. So it's especially meaningful to me that they would be willing to join. This is a book that has history. It's a book that has argument. And it's a book that has stories. And one of those stories is the story that led me actually to be motivated to write the book. I was a public defender in the mid-1990s in Washington, D.C., and I had taken the job because I viewed this work as the civil rights work of my generation. We didn't call it mass incarceration at the time, but the fact that 1 in 3 black men were in the criminal justice system already was known. The Sentencing Project had issued those reports. And a number of us were starting to enter the field to put our bodies on the line to say, what could we do to challenge this? And I decided to do that as a public defender. And I was in court in the mid-90s representing a young man by the name of Brandon. Brandon was charged with possession of a gun and possession of marijuana. It was his first arrest, and I was arguing that he be released. I was arguing that he be released on probation, and I had letters from his judges, from his counselors, from his social workers. His mother and grandmother were in court. The prosecutor, I should say, Brandon, like 95% of my clients, was African American. The prosecutor, also African American, was asking for him to be locked up. She wanted him to go to Oak Hill. Vinnie Schiraldi, where are you? She wanted him to go to Oak Hill, which is a dungeon. Vinnie Schiraldi can tell you about it, and if you don't know him, please go take one of his classes. He's over in the Kennedy School. He can tell you how terrible and dysfunctional that place was. I was asking him to get out. And the judge was pondering this decision, and he said, well, Brandon, before I tell you what I'm going to do, I need to share some things with you. He said, Mr. Foreman has told me that you've had a hard life. Well, let me tell you, the judge, himself African American, let me tell you what it was like for black boys when I was young. Let me tell you what Jim Crow was like. And let me tell you how people fought and struggled and marched and died, gave their lives. Martin Luther King died for you to have opportunities that didn't exist in my generation. And I know the one thing they marched and died for was not for you to be out there running and gunning and thugging and embarrassing your family and embarrassing your community. And no, son, I can't give you that chance today. I hope you turn your life around the way Mr. Foreman said you would, but right now, you're going to have to go to Oak Hill. And he locked him up. And when I left court that day, after visiting Brandon, who was back in the cell with a number of other black boys, young black men, as I left court that day, I thought about the fact that I was operating in a justice system that had significant African American representation. The city council that wrote the laws, that the gun and drug laws that Brandon was prosecuted for, was a majority black. The police force was a majority African American, and the police chief was too. And everybody in the courtroom was that day. It wasn't true every day, but it wasn't uncommon, and everybody was that day. And it occurred to me that there was another story that needed to be told, a story that needed to be written about how it was, what happened over the last 40 or 50 years in America and in our black communities that would lead an enfranchised black city like Washington, D.C. to lock up its own. So that's the question of my book. I know there's some grad students here in the room, and I just want to then pause for 1 minute just to say here that I had a topic, but I didn't yet have a way to tell the story because I didn't have the data that I needed. I thought the way that I could write this book was historically, but to make that work, I couldn't rely just on newspaper accounts. I needed to get some transcripts from the D.C. Council in the 1970s and 1980s. I needed to see in a granular way what those debates look like. It's hard to get legislative history from cities and states. That's one of the reasons why so much of the work is on the federal government. It's because it's where the transcripts are. The D.C. Council said they had transcripts on their websites, but when I would show up at the Legislative Affairs Office, they would just look at me so strange, like no researcher had ever come here looking for transcripts. They didn't know what I was talking about, and I would point to the website, and they say, oh, Mr. Foreman, it might say that on the website, but I haven't seen those. It took me about a year and a half of going down and sending letters, and finally there had to be a change. They had to put a new person in the front office who was a little bit more willing to go to the back and actually open up the vault. And lo and behold, there were some cassette tapes there. But now the problem was getting those cassette tapes into some form that I could use them. They also had a few transcripts that were on a microfilm machine. One of my research assistants, a woman named Rena O'Leary, without whom this book truly would not exist, called me one day and she said, "Professor Foreman, I'm in the office and there's transcripts. I'm reading them." And she just started pressing print, print, print. And she broke the microfilm machine, but she came out of that room with like 1,000 pages of a transcript of a debate on whether to decriminalize marijuana in 1975, which the first majority black city council took up as an issue. And that became chapter 1 of the book. So keep looking for the transcripts. Okay, so I've told you the question of the book. I'm not going to be able to answer the question in this talk, but let me just give you a few of some of the major themes. So the first one is the question of crime. In Washington, D.C., in the late 1960s, right before this majority black council comes into power, in D.C. and around the nation, we see a crime explosion of the likes that had not been seen previously in American history. Homicide triples in Washington, D.C. in the 1960s. Heroin addiction is ravaging the city and ravaging black America. In D.C. in 1967, 3% of the people in the D.C. jail tested positive for heroin, and a year later it was 45%. That's an epidemic. But it's not just numbers, right? It's also how this affected people's lives. One of the things that I was most surprised by when I went and I looked at letters, so a number of D.C. council members have put their files in the George Washington University Library. They're not organized, unfortunately, so you just have to look through page after page after page. But if you're willing to spend years doing it, you will find some things. And one of the things that you'll find is that there's hundreds, thousands of letters from citizens to their city council members complaining, saying, "We feel like we're prisoners in our homes. We feel like we're strangers on our streets. We're desperate. Crime and violence and addiction is destroying our communities, and you have to do something." Who's the you? Who's getting these letters? This gets to the second argument in my book. The people who are receiving these letters are the first generation of African American political leaders who has been elected to office after the decline and demise of Jim Crow. They are people whose lives, whose entire lives were dedicated to making Black Lives Matter. Chapter 2 of my book is called Black Lives Matter because they were very self-consciously committed to the concept of making Black Lives Matter. They had come out of traditions in the South where the police didn't come to respond to crime in black communities. That's just another dead black person, and they didn't say black person. Randy Kennedy wrote the book on, I'm not even talking about that book. I'm talking about the book on Under Protection. Randy Kennedy's history is what these people lived. Now they were in power, and they were absolutely bound and determined to respond to those constituents who were demanding protection because it had never been provided before. They viewed, and many of them were like the judge in my initial story, they viewed the protection of black communities as a civil rights matter. That's why I wasn't the only person in the courtroom who thought I was the civil rights warrior. They thought so too. Now, this gets to the third question, third argument of the book. They didn't only want more policing, more law enforcement, more prisons. This is a story about African American agency, but like any story about agency, it's a story about constraints. They didn't have the power to do everything they wanted to do. Almost every single actor I can find in my book who's arguing for more police, more prisons, more punishment, is also asking for root causes to be addressed, is also asking for better schools, better housing, more parks and recreation, a Marshall Plan for urban America. I mean, I stopped counting the number of times I came across the term Marshall Plan for urban America. But they didn't get that. They had an all-of-the-above strategy. They wanted to throw everything at the problem. But they didn't control Congress. They didn't control the national government, right? These are state. So this is a story about what you can do at the state and local level, but it's also a story about what the limits of what you can do at the state and local level. In a lot of ways, the story, this part of the story can be summed up like this. The actors in my book had the power to respond to crime, but they didn't have the power to respond to the conditions that led to crime. They did what they could, but it wasn't enough. The last thing that I'll say, and then I'll stop here because I really want to hear Professor Sullivan, Professor Western, and I want Ron Sullivan to get up here before his jury calls with hopefully the 2 sweetest words in the English language. That would be not guilty for those of y'all that aren't public defenders. Sitting where we sit now, knowing everything that we know about what's happened in the criminal justice system and how damaging it's been to really all of America, but in particular to Black America, and most particularly to low-income Black America, they had to see it coming, right? No. This is ultimately the most tragic part of the story. This is a book about people that are making decisions at a time, like anybody, not knowing what's going to happen next. So you can see this most clearly in the marijuana decriminalization chapter. 1975, first Black city council comes into office. 11 of 13 members African American, 4 or 5 of them out of SNCC. These are hardcore civil rights workers. A white city council member by the name of Dave Clark says, we should decriminalize marijuana. And he cites the racial disparities in arrest rates at the time, even in '75. The opposition comes from Black churches, and it comes from a Black nationalist minister by the name of Doug Moore, and a former civil rights worker, friend of Stokely Carmichael's, supported by the Prisoners Alliance. Back then, there were groups like Prisoners Alliance. These were prisoners in D.C. jail. They endorsed a candidate. They endorsed Doug Moore. He was a race man. He was not an Uncle Tom. He opposed marijuana decriminalization. And he did it because he said, our Black children cannot afford to be getting high. White kids in the suburbs, yeah, they can do that. They have resources. They have family. They have people that can get them into counseling if they need it. They have teachers they have parents that can go up to school and make sure that they get kept in school, even if a teacher suspects that they've been high. They can do all that. But our kids live on the margin. They have no room for error. So we can't decriminalize marijuana and then have them out there getting high. They won't be able. This is the amazing thing. These people wanted the Black Revolution. They said, you can't fight a Black Revolution if our people are high. Then the response was, well, but really it's not such a big deal to criminalize marijuana, right? In your first arrest, almost nobody gets prosecuted, which was true. And really almost nobody goes to jail in D.C. at the time for possession of marijuana. So it's like, it's not that big of a deal. This was the response by the people like Dave Clark. I'm sorry, this was the position of people like Doug Moore for why they thought it would be okay to keep it criminalized. They were right at the time. They didn't know that in the 1980s we would then launch a war on drugs where it would become true that even a marijuana arrest could make you ineligible for public housing, ineligible for private housing if the rental agency was checking the records aggressively, ineligible for student loans, ineligible for jobs from employers who can not hire you at will, including if you have a marijuana arrest that it did not lead to a conviction. So they had no idea what was to come of this. And that's ultimately the tragedy of the story. And the final thing that I'll say is that this is also the opportunity. Because in the same way that this system was built up with 1,000 small steps across the country among disaggregated actors, from police to probation to prisons officials across 50 states and DC and 3,000 counties, and private employers, right, who buttress the criminal justice system's harshness by refusing to hire people with records. In the same way, everybody built this up with these small steps towards punitiveness. We can unwind it the same way. And that's the only way we're going to be able to unwind it. It's not going to be a single piece of legislation. It's not going to be a silver bullet. So the next time somebody says to you, what would be the better way to reduce mass incarceration, A or B? The answer is both. It's always both. Thank you.
So I will be very brief. While Professor Foreman wants to hear what I say, I know all of you could care less and want to hear what he says. So I'm going to take just a few minutes and apologize in advance for having to duck out. I'm supposed to be within 10 minutes of the Suffolk Superior Court, except when I'm teaching or office hours. So as a good lawyer, I'm construing this as an office hour and well within the court's order. So I'll start off by just saying what an absolutely terrific advocate James Foreman was and is. He was my senior, because he's older than I am, at the D.C. Public Defender Service, and I learned very much from you, James, and particularly learned what Charles Ogletree has characterized as empathic representation. That is departing from the traditional model of stoic objectivism for lawyers and caring about the individual who's sitting next to you, his or her cares, desires, strivings. And there was no more passionate and empathic lawyer at the D.C. Public Defender Service than you, James, and you taught me lessons that I've absolutely never forgotten. In addition to that, he's a remarkably insightful scholar. So he's just got the whole package. You can't, a great trial lawyer, wonderful scholar. In reading the book, first I have to say that all of the pseudonyms, I just relived the stories because, of course I knew exactly who everybody was in the stories. And it was such a pleasure. I felt like I relived our PDS experience going through that. And the central dilemma, the tension that Professor Foreman recognizes is something that we all lived through. And it was an irony of sorts. As a young African-American lawyer going to D.C., it was empowering to walk into a courtroom and there was an African-American judge, and that was not an oddity. In fact, it was quite normal that you walk in and the judge and the prosecutor, the bailiff, the social workers. I mean, it wasn't an odd thing like it is in most, very many jurisdictions across the country. And that, that makes a young lawyer of color feel good. You think that, I can aspire to be the chief judge was an African American, for example. The mayor. I mean, it just you felt like your chances were limitless. But the defendant was almost always African American as well, and we would rail against the prosecutors to the same degree that we would in any other jurisdiction. Oh, they're insensitive, they're uncaring, and so forth. And we all recognize that, well, this is an interesting picture because everyone is African American, and why are we in this position? So one of the things that separates James Foreman from most people is that rather than just complaining about the question, he actually did the hard work and thought about it and did the work of answering this question, why? And the major insight which he described is that he described it as a all of the above strategy, that it never was just about law and order, but also about the structural conditions that led to the sort of criminality that the District of Columbia was experiencing. And one of the things I would ask, James, in reading the book, it reminded me of a couple things, but one is the wonderful work that our departed colleague Bill Stuntz did on criminal law, where he argued that one of the problems with criminal law legislation is that it's not localized. That is to say, the people who write the laws don't experience what happens when these laws are enforced to the degree that they are, that these neighborhoods aren't, they don't live in the neighborhoods that are torn apart by these laws. So there's no disincentive for making them stronger and harsher and so forth. And even with the thesis that there was a all-in-one, all of the above strategic approach, I wonder to the extent some of the laws were drawn, and not only drawn, but enforced because, like Bill Stuntz argued, the effects of the law were not experienced as directly as they would be in other communities because, as you mentioned in the book, even the sons and daughters of the civil rights movement have begun to move into a different class strata. And while all of us have, and I surely do, that cousin, the likelihood of a more direct interaction or interface with the law in the negative ways that we saw every day in D.C., while possible, was not that likely. And so even if there was a desire for a both approach, I wonder the extent to which the class forces allowed those legislatures not to push as hard for the structural side of it, and whether you think that has anything, or that might in part explain some of the decisions. So by the time we got to the District of Columbia in the mid-'90s and started practicing, so the African American judge class, everyone had moved to what's called the Gold Coast in D.C., relatively wealthy area, and had a set of concerns that were not terribly different from middle to upper middle class Americans across the country. And one of the things were that we wanted our neighborhood safe, and we wanted this and we wanted that. And so anyway, I don't want to beat a dead horse. So this the class issue, might that be explanatory? This localization or lack of localization of the effects of the criminal law, might that explain some of it? And the final thing I'll say is I thought one of the jewels of the book is how open-minded and generous you were with people whom we used to not say very nice things about a couple decades ago. And it really made me think that the battle for civil rights actually is fought on very many fronts, and people of very good will might have different approaches to the same problem. And rather than screaming at them, maybe we ought to have talked to them a little more back then, assuming they would be inclined to have listened. But there are so many motivations with respect to how we might solve this problem of over-incarceration. And one of the things, and I'll end with, that Dean Minow did not mention in the introduction, is that James was one of a cadre of lawyers, even then at the Public Defender Service, who said that even what we were doing was not sufficient, that in many ways the system was so biased and rigged against the clients whom we represented that we were in some ways merely cogs in a system that resulted in this over-incarceration and this disparate incarceration, and rather than shaking his fist at the darkness, he went out and attempted to actually left PDS, took a leave, and attempted to fix some of the structural problems at issue, and that gave birth to the Maya Angelou School, where he went and took court-involved youth and started a school because one of the things that he recognized was that the correlation between absence of educational resources and criminality was extraordinary. Just extraordinary. They would do these education write-ups, and you would I've forgotten the level, was it level 5 or something? I've forgotten the particular vocabulary now, but the notion was that correlation was unmistakable, and Professor Foreman did something about it. So thank you for this extraordinary work, James, and I'm much better for it now.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I was just saying I want to thank the Law School Library for hosting today, and to Dean Minow for the introduction. I was just saying to James before this panel, I wish I had longer to digest the book, because it's very provocative, and I enjoyed it enormously. So there's this orthodoxy that we tell about the emergence of mass incarceration in America, and when we talk about mass incarceration, we're talking about this tremendous escalation of prison and jail populations over the last 40 years, and the incarceration rate in the United States has increased fivefold since the early 1970s. And there's this massive racial disparity. African Americans are 6 to 8 times more likely to go to prison than whites, and there's a huge class disparity that's overlaid on top of that, where for recent birth cohorts of black men, if they dropped out of high school, chances that they'll go to prison at some point in their lives is now about 70%. And we only have to go back a generation or so to find a time when the penal system wasn't a ubiquitous presence in the lives of black men with low levels of schooling. And as part of this orthodoxy that we tell about mass incarceration, the story we tell is that this tough-on-crime movement that began in the early 1970s really grew out as a conservative backlash to the civil rights movement, and it was driven in large part by the Republican Party trying to capture the South, and the Southern strategy is mounted in 1968, and it sort of colours conservative politics through the 1970s and 1980s, and we see the emergence of a very punitive sentencing regime. That's the mass incarceration orthodoxy, and this is the argument into which James is moving, and provides, I think, a very, very challenging analysis. So at least 2 things are missing from this orthodox story. Where is violence? Where is crime in that story? If it's essentially a story about a conservative backlash to the civil rights movement, where is the social reality on the ground of real problems of violence in our most disadvantaged communities of colour? That's one question. And the other is, where is black political agency in that story? Where is the civil rights leadership? Where are the local representatives? Where is the advocacy community in that story? And that is also missing from the orthodox story of mass incarceration. And it's a rich book, and there are three, I think, really powerful ideas that I take from the book that really speak to this orthodoxy. And one is that there was a very strong politics in local communities that was desperately asking for a response to serious problem of crime. And part of this politics and part of this politics was asking for harsher punishment. But the motivation for it was an argument about the importance of black victimisation and a serious valuation of African American crime victims, which had been largely left out of the national conversation. I thought that was a really important idea. The second was that these local politics always often coupled a politics of punishment to a politics of root causes. Both had to be addressed. There was a demand for a more punitive response on the one hand, but this was always supplementing a demand for public policy to address the problems of segregation, concentrated poverty, and other dimensions of concentrated disadvantage. And the third really powerful idea that struck me was that the incremental and unintended emergence of mass incarceration, of a multitude of small changes in policing, in courtroom practice, in sentencing policy. I think one interesting thing about this incremental and unintended emergence of mass incarceration is that all of this uncoordinated activity and transformation in the criminal justice system ultimately, over decades, tended to work together and tended to push in the same direction to greater punishment and greater severity. And I think and here I think I share something with Ron in a conversation I think we need to have. Why did that happen? Why did all of these small incremental changes tend to converge in a more punitive regime? And I think part of the story is that there was a larger national political context here, which made some outcomes more likely than others, and that's I think that's part of the story, and I think that's an important piece of how we should think about criminal justice reform politics today. There are millions of important local initiatives going on now, but it is happening in the context of this larger national political frame, which we have to be aware of. In addition to that, these three important ideas, the book is just a great read. If you have not read it, this is a lively narrative, and I felt I was there, 1975, in DC, attending these council meetings and getting to know these local actors. There is a realism to the political story that James tells, and So it hums along, and the sense of agency that narrative provides, I think, is very, very powerful. And as political history, for me, I found it totally compelling. Okay, I want to put 3 questions on the table for James and the room, and then I will stop. And these are questions about the book's analysis and where it brings us to now in the current criminal justice reform conversation. One of the big challenges of the book is the social problem of violence, and how do we think about the problem of violence in a context now where we have this morally urgent issue of over-incarceration. And the challenge is we cannot ignore the problem of violence. We don't want to be in a political box where we're only extending leniency and compassion to this elusive and somewhat perhaps mythic category of offenders called non-violent drug offenders. If that's the sort of full extent of our reformist sentiment, then the extent of criminal justice reform is going to be very limited. And unless we can think of a new way, a new public policy response to people who are convicted of violence, the retreat from mass incarceration will be very, very limited. One way of thinking about this, or one way I think about it as a sociologist, is the violence that I see as I go out and talk to people who are involved in the criminal justice, people who are involved in the criminal justice system. The violence that I see is extremely contextual, and it's very much a product of being oftentimes in very poor homes, in very poor neighbourhoods, under an enormous amount of stress and material hardship, and facing a great deal of economic insecurity, feeling alienated from mainstream social institutions, feeling that criminal justice authorities are certainly not going to be an important and productive source of order in your life. So violence is often a very contextual thing, and that partly means that we're often dealing not with violent people but with violent situations, and one could be on either side of violence in any given circumstance. One could be a victim, one could be an offender, one could be a witness, one could be a participant when there's no clear victim or offender. This strikes me as what violence looks like. Is this a different kind of language about violence that might gain traction? That's less blaming and that retreats from the morality tale that we often like to tell, in which there are victims and offenders, good people and bad people, and for which punishment is the presumptive solution for bad people. Violence is contextual. So what is that context? Frequently it's context of segregation, concentrated poverty, and disadvantage. And this was the other part of the politics of crime that James unearths going back to the 1970s. How much do we have to talk about these social conditions of segregation, concentrated poverty today? Can that get traction today? This seems a very challenging conversation currently, in which we appear to have a broken federal budgetary process. There seems to be very little appetite for robust social policy, and yet this is the very harsh conditions of poverty in America is a compelling source, I think, of what are still high rates of violence, even though violence is historically low, the relative levels of violence are still very high in very disadvantaged communities. Should our criminal justice reform politics include addressing root causes? We seem to have backed away from that currently. Final question. And I'd be interested to hear your view on this, because it wasn't totally clear to me from the book. And so often, right, in public policy, we think about finding justice for victims of bad policy, bad policing, bad sentencing policy. We think about justice for the victims of bad policy in terms of good policy going forward. We want to do policing better. We want a fairer system of sentencing. But this leaves unaddressed the historic harms that communities have suffered at the hands of bad policy over decades. And how do we address those historic? Historic harms? And I think there's sort of a deep question of racial justice here, and what that might look like. Is there room to talk about things like truth and reconciliation commissions? Is there room to talk about things like reparations or cultural monuments to a history of injustice that the criminal justice system might have produced? How should we think about this in our contemporary politics? So they're my three questions. I would urge everyone in the room to read the book. I think this is such an important intervention and such an important challenge to what I worry has become a somewhat calcified orthodoxy in our understanding of the problem of mass incarceration. So thank you very much, James.
Okay, so I know two things. One, there's some folks that have class starting at 1, so of course, if you feel free to attend as a professor, I would say never be late for class. And I will go back to the table, so we will stop this part of it at 1, and I'll go back to the table and I'll sign books for anybody who would like me to. But that does leave us about 7 or 8 minutes for questions, so in deference to the audience, I won't respond to the very provocative questions from both Professor Sullivan and Professor Western, just to give anybody from the audience who has a burning question a chance to ask it. I think a mic is going around because they're recording. And I should say, while the mic is being handed around, thank you for this. I thanked both of them individually, but I want to thank them publicly for these amazing comments. Bye, Jack. Bye, Lucy. Thank you for coming.
This question is for all the panelists, but specifically for you, Mr. Foreman. And it's a really, really simple question. In mainstream media and a lot of the scholarly conversations, the focus is on Black men. This week in one of my classes, my professor is right there, Professor Schwartzall. We read portions of Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow and portions of your response to it. And in those readings, I found Black men repeatedly mentioned, but I didn't see one instance of Black women. And today, in the anecdotes and in the statistics, you focused on Black men. So my challenge for all of you is to bring Black women into this conversation too. And my question is simply, do you accept that challenge?
Absolutely, I accept that challenge, and I thank you for your question. So I apologize in 20 minutes, that's not possible to summarize a book. But I will tell you that chapter 4 of my book and chapter 6 of my book both revolve around black women, stories of black women who are mistreated in the criminal justice system. So I can't respond to your criticism of Michelle Alexander, but I can tell you that if you read my book from beginning to end, you will read a lot about black women and the way in which they've been harmed in the criminal justice system. So I absolutely accept your challenge.
So can I just add, instead of just writing about it in the book, in conversations like this, can you talk about it? Like in your anecdotes, in your statistics?
Yes.
I wanted to ask a question to our speakers about, for anyone who's interested in this space, especially for students who may be entering this field and are looking towards the future and what can be done, how much progress is possible and is stymied in the face of a potentially uncooperative federal government? So a lot of the kind of systemic forces that you mentioned that contribute to this effect of mass incarceration and this disparate impact upon our black communities is tied to a lot of systems like our education system, our criminalization laws. But so far in our current administration, I don't think we're going to see any sort of immediate progress on, say, the legalization of marijuana on a federal level. Or injections of like federal public money into our education system. So given light of recent setbacks and sort of certain barriers, what can we do in the immediate term, and how do our strategies as advocates and lawyers change in light, and how should we adjust?
So that's a great question. I actually, a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times, the title is Justice Springs Eternal. So I wrote a column about exactly this topic. And so I'm delighted to have you ask that question. So it is true, right, that at the national level right now, between Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions, there's not I think it's unrealistic to think there's going to be anything other than backlash on criminal justice issues. It is. So then the question is your question. So is it possible then to continue to make any progress? And I think the answer to that is yes. 88% of prisoners are in state, local, and county prisons, not in federal prisons. 88%. 85% of law enforcement is state, local, and county law enforcement, not federal law enforcement. Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions get the attention in the same way that Barack Obama and Eric Holder got the attention. But they are not, in fact, the decision makers that led to mass incarceration or that are going to unwind it. It's people like Vinny Schiraldi, who is the head of the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services in Washington, D.C., after being a social worker and an advocate who complained about that Oak Hill, that dungeon that I told you about in the beginning of the story, who then took the job to head the government agency and made it his responsibility and said, we're going to create an agency that cares for kids. That's what we're going to do. And if that means I have to blow up this building, which he did, and build a new one, then I'll do it. If that means I have to root out this broken, corrupt school that's at the heart of this building and bring in a high-quality educational provider, I'll do it. So my argument is that we have to stay at the state, county, and local level. And that's true, by the way. One of the things, I'm out in California now, and I hear all this talk of, oh, well, I'm in a liberal bubble out in California. What can I do? If I were in Oklahoma or Texas, maybe I could get involved, but I'm in California. No. This is a blue state problem just as much as it is a red state problem. New York State just passed a partial raise the age law. Until last week, New York State was one of 2 states in the country that continued to try all 16 and 17-year-olds automatically transferred into adult court. That's a blue state problem. California is the nation's second largest incarcerator. That's a blue state problem. There is no liberal bubble. So wherever you live, know your state representative. in that not just your congressional representative, who's in the state house? Who's your local prosecutor? In the last election cycle, when Trump was elected, we saw a slate of progressive prosecutors around this country, including in Florida, Alabama, Texas, who won elections. And they won it on a criminal justice reform agenda. In red states, in red counties, a guy in Texas, a former defense lawyer with the words "not guilty" tattooed on his chest, won the race for local prosecutor in Texas. Those of y'all that are in law school know the incredible power that prosecutors have in our criminal justice system. So if we want to make progress in this area, you got to find out who these people are, support them, because that's how we're going to roll this thing back. And then just do your best. And as far as Sessions and Trump go, do your best just to be able to get out of bed and keep fighting, despite all the nonsense you're going to be hearing from them. I know. But everybody who's locked up in this country needs us to be able to do that, no matter how demoralized we feel when we read those kinds of accounts. Those of us that have a liberty and a freedom, we don't have the liberty and freedom to get demoralized. It's 1 o'clock, so we got to stop. Thank you.